Okay, well, welcome to tonight's study. Um, I had to make what we call an executive decision. We're going to finish the book of Numbers tonight. And the reason that we're going to go through the last 11 chapters of the book of Numbers is because if you try to break it up, there's not really enough to talk about. But if you put it together, there's some principles and lessons that you can draw out from the materials. A lot of what's in these chapters are things that we covered already, but they're covered in a different way. And so as we go through these 11 chapters, I want you to think about,
10 people on most.
okay, I'm sorry, I hear a voice somewhere. Okay, anyway, I want you to think about some of the lessons and applications that we're going to draw after we have our discussion questions. Now, last week we had a real fun study because we saw God in a sense of humor. We learned how God in his sovereignty frustrated and overrode King Balak's attempt to use a pagan prophet to oppose Israel by prohibiting Balaam from cursing Israel. Balaam was a pagan prophet. He made a living charging fees to consult pagan gods on behalf of pagan kings, and was hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse Israel. Now, you really can't manipulate something that doesn't exist. Balaam was manipulating his customers, the kings and the pagans that would hire him to curse other nations. He basically couldn't lose because all he did is he called upon these false deities, said what the kings wanted, and then got paid a handsome fee. And this would make the kings believe that their gods favored whatever adventure they're going on. And it kind of became the art of positive thinking because the gods were in favor of these pagan gods that didn't exist, were in favor of pagan kings, and they paid a handsome amount of money to this prophet. Everybody felt good. And if they're defeated, well, then the customer that paid you this handsome fee is gone, and you just go on and to the next king that you want to profit for. Apparently, Balaam had never dealt with the one true God of Israel and thought that he could impose a curse on the Israelites who God chosen to bless. The main message from last week's study was that despite Balak's attempt to manipulate God by hiring Balaam, a pagan prophet, to curse Israel, God always does what he and his sovereignty decides to do, and God is always faithful to the promises and covenants he makes with his chosen people. God is not going to be fooled by a pagan prophet. In fact, we learned how he got the donkey to talk and how he got Balaam to bless Israel, even though his intent was to curse Israel and draw a big fee. And so we really got the comparison of the irony between the talking donkey and the false prophet and the prophecies that blessed Israel instead of cursing Israel. Now, this week, we're going to learn about the transfer of leadership and the preparation and plans which the Israelites were required to make before crossing the Jordan River and taking possession of the promised land. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that until God's plan for eternity is complete, each generation must establish their own relationship of faith and trust in God before they can take possession of and claim God's promises as their own. So what we have is God's eternal plan. And during the history of mankind, it's carried out generation to generation. And each generation is required to establish their own relationship with God as God unfolds his eternal plan that will come into fruition in the future. So the outline of what we're going to talk about in these 11 chapters is that the lesson is God gave final instructions to Moses in preparation for Israel to invade Canaan. So we're going to have an overview of these 11 chapters, and then we're going to talk about the second census of the fighting men of Israel. Then we're going to talk about the inheritance allowed to Zelophehad's 5 daughters, and the fact that now God instructed Moses to choose Joshua to replace him. Then we're going to review a quick review of the required sacrifices and feasts. Then we're going to have God's reminder about making vows. And then God instructs Israel to take vengeance against the Midianites, chapter 31. And forget about all the hymns in there. When I turn off if I don't turn off my dictation device, it gets a bunch of hymns there. So we're just going to celebrate about God's instructions to take vengeance against the Midianites. Then we're going to talk about the Reubenites and Gadites' request to remain in the Transjordan area, and then review of Israel's 40-year journey through the wilderness, and conclude with the boundaries and allocation of the promised land. Then we'll go into the discussion questions and conclude with implications, conclusions, and applications. So let's go to the study itself. Part 1. God gave final instructions to Moses in preparation for Israel to invade Canaan. Now, the overview of the final 11 chapters of the book of Numbers. All of the events in these last 11 chapters take place while the Israelites remain camped on the plains of Moab by the Jordan River, right across from Jericho. And if you know your Bible, the first city in the land of Canaan that the Israelites conquered was Jericho, the city of Jericho. Now, the plains of Moab was the marshaling area where the Israelites made their final plans and preparations to invade, defeat, and conquer the kingdoms and peoples who occupied the promised land. Anybody that has ever been in the military that experienced a mobilization, what you do is you have to bring the troops together with the equipment. You have to provide ammunition and fuel for the equipment. You have to provide transportation and the means of executing the mission, all the plans. You have to put them all together in one place. We call that either an assembly area or a marshaling area. An assembly area is more administrative, where you draw all your equipment and everything. A marshaling area is where you start to form your battle formations to attack and to achieve your objective. And so you had in the Persian Gulf War, you had the assembly area that was in various parts of the Saudi Arabia, but then you had the marshaling area that was right on the border of Iraq. And in the marshaling area, that's when the units took their combat battle positions to attack. And so what we see here in the plains of Moab is both an assembly and a marshaling area in preparation for Israel to go into the and take possession of the promised land. What's different is they didn't send spies in to reconnoiter. What they did is they trusted that God was going to lead them into victory, and they prepared to go into Canaan. The plans which the Israelites made included identifying the number of warriors who would do all the fighting. This is the second census of the fighting men. Allocating, assigning, and designating what territories in Canaan would be allocated and occupied by each of the tribes of Israel, except for the tribes of Levi and Simeon, who in fulfillment of Jacob's deathbed curse against them for their participation in the massacre of the Shechemites, prophesied that they would not receive an inheritance of land, but would be scattered throughout Jacob. That's the area occupied by the future tribe of the future area occupied by Jacob, and dispersed throughout Israel, which ultimately was the northern kingdom. And if you remember, because they took a daughter of Jacob and they defiled her, they tricked the Shechemites into a peace treaty, and they required them to be circumcised. And as they were recovering from being circumcised, then the Israelites from the tribes of Levi and Simeon went in and slaughtered them. And Jacob cursed these two tribes because of what they had done. And the curse now is being carried out in the fact that neither the tribe of Levi or the tribe of Simeon were allowed an allotment of land in Canaan. The Israelites were dispersed throughout, and the tribe of Simeon was sort of intermingled with the tribe of Judah. Now, they also, and plans and preparations, they determined the location of the 48 towns, which were designated as priestly cities, and which would be assigned to the Levites as their inheritance in lieu of receiving territory. Of these 48 priestly cities, 6 were further designated as cities of refuge. And then finally, in their plans and preparations, they transferred the leadership of the Israelites from Moses to Joshua. So what we have here are the administrative requirements that were taken care of to plan for the invasion of Canaan. And this assignment by lot of the areas in Canaan that the Israelites would be awarded once they conquered the area. If you study the book of Joshua, all the army was used to fight against the cities and the 5 kings. But after that, the tribes broken down into the areas that they were assigned to occupy in the promised land, and each tribe finished conquering the peoples that were left over in those areas. So while the Israelites were completing their plans and preparations to invade Canaan, God reminded them that he had separated and set the Israelites apart as his holy nation. And God reminded them that they must perform the daily, weekly, which is the Sabbath, monthly, and yearly sacrifices, which he instructed their parents to perform. God said, you're going over the promised land, but I'm the same God, and you're still sinful people, and you need to make these sacrifices in worship of me and in atonement for your sin. He also instructed them that the Israelites must completely destroy and remove the pagan people from the land. Otherwise, they would eventually be corrupted by their pagan practices. This is reinforced by God's command for the Israelites to completely destroy the Midianites, for luring them into apostasy by sending their women to the Israelite encampment to cause the Israelites to turn away from God by engaging in the pagan sexual practices and ceremonies and worshiping the pagan gods. This ended up in the plague, which concluded the chapter 25, which when the plague ended, now we start with the last 11 chapters of the book of Numbers. While these 11 chapters include numerous details about Israel's preparations to cross the Jordan, enter into Canaan, and conquer the people and kingdoms who occupied Canaan, the Israelites never were to lose sight of the fact that they were about to fulfill God's promise to Abraham made 500 years earlier. This generation held on to the promise that God made to Abraham 500 years earlier, the promise that they would be given possession and be able to occupy the promised land. God's promise made 500 years ago is about to be fulfilled. So let's go on now. We're going to go into these chapters in detail. Chapter 26, the second census of the people. After the plague sent by God ended, God commanded Moses and Eleazar, who is the priest, the son of Aaron that replaced him as a high priest, to take a new census of the eligible fighting men by tribe and by clans. Now, what I did in the outline on page 6, I compared the results of the first census taken after the first generation of Israelites departed from Egypt, which we learned about in the first part of the book of Numbers, to the second census that takes place at the end of the book of Numbers, just before they go into the promised land. So again, we have the same 12 tribes listed. And in the first census, the cumulative or aggregate total of all fighting men, all men from these tribes that were age 20 or older, was 603,550. As a result of the second census, we have 7 tribes that gained fighting men and 5 tribes that lost fighting men. But the total of 601,730 is pretty close or comparable to the fighting men of the first census. What we see here is, despite God's punishment of having all the Israelites of the first generation, except a handful of Moses, Aaron, Miriam, Caleb, and Joshua, all the other ones die out, the Israelites' population really didn't change much, and they still had approximately the same number of fighting men to go into the promised land. That in itself is God's providence, that he would use the Israelites to carry out his redemptive plan. So we talked about the 7 tribes that had an increase in number and the 5 tribes that saw a decrease, but we see the comparability or the similarity in aggregate number of fighting men. The count of the number of fighting men in each tribe and clan in the second census was used to allocate and distribute the land in Canaan. In the first census that was taken, they only counted the fighting men in each of the tribes. In this census, if you go through it carefully, you'll see that they have not only the fighting men aggregated for each tribe, but it's broken down by each clan in the tribe. The reason for this is that the numbers of fighting men correlated to the number of people, which correlated to the amount of territory that clan would be allocated in the promised land. The larger the clan, the more land they got. The smaller the clan, the less land they got. And so the allocation by tribe and by clan was in preparation for how Israel would eventually occupy the promised land. In Numbers chapters 26, verses 52 through 56, the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, the land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance based upon the number of names. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance, and to a smaller group, a smaller one. Each is to receive its inheritance according to the number of those listed. Be sure that the land is distributed by lot. What each group inherits will be according to the names for its ancestral tribe. Each inheritance is to be distributed by lot among the larger and smaller groups. So when we're talking about the numbers or groups, we're really talking about the numbers and groups in each clan of the 12 tribes. The tribe of Levites was set aside to serve God and were not counted in the number of fighting men, just like the first census that was taken. However, all the males a month old or more were also counted by their clans. The total number of male Levites a month older or older totaled $23,000. Again, that's a comparable amount to the number of Levites a month or older that were counted in the first census. Unlike the first census, no comparison of the number of firstborn in the other tribes and the male Levites was made for the purposes of making a redemption payment to the tribe of Levites. If you recall, God equalized the number of firstborn by making the tribes that had an excess number of male firstborn children pay a shekel to the Levites as a ransom for those people. And this is all part of God's plan, that the tribe of Levite was set aside to serve God, and it was set aside in lieu of all the firstborn of all the tribes of Israel. So the firstborn were God's, but God took the firstborn of all tribes and replaced them with the tribe of Levite and had shekels paid to the tribe of Levite for the excess number of firstborn in the other tribes. Now, the next thing that comes up in chapter 27 is the question of the inheritance allowed to Zelophehad's 5 daughters, and then Joshua being chosen to succeed Moses. After the census of the number of fighting men in the 12 tribes of Israel was taken, the 5 daughters of Zelophehad from the tribe of Manasseh, who died in the wilderness without a son surviving them, came to Moses, asking Moses for them to be included in the allocation of land. What we have here is we have one of the clan leaders who died, Zelophehad, who died without any surviving son, without any son. He had 5 daughters, and the 5 daughters said, basically, we're going to be disinherited. Our whole clan is disinherited because our father died without a surviving son. And they went to Moses to say, we want to claim as women our father's share of the inheritance. Moses went to God, and their request for an inheritance of land was favorably granted by God. God, in granting the request, told Moses in Numbers chapter 27, verses 5 through 7, so Moses brought the case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, what Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and give their father's inheritance over to them. So if you ever want to talk about equality between the sexes in the Bible, this is an area in the Old Testament before they even went into the land of Canaan Canaan, where the daughters of a father who died without a son surviving them were allowed to take the father's inheritance. So after God revealed to Moses that it was time for Moses to be gathered to his people, Moses demonstrated his love for the Israelites by asking God to appoint a new leader, a shepherd, to lead them. In Numbers chapter 27, verses 12 through 17, the scriptures say, "Then the Lord said to Moses, go up this mountain in the Abiram range and see the land that I've given to the Israelites. After you have seen it, you too will be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was. For when the community rebelled at the waters of the desert of Zin, both of you disobeyed my command to honor me as holy before their eyes. These were the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of Zin." Moses said to the Lord, "May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all mankind, appoint a man over this community to go out and to come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in. So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd." Isn't that interesting? This is a phrase that's picked up in the New Testament when we talk about Jesus being the shepherd of God's people, the true shepherd. And what we have here is that Moses does not argue with God or questions God's sovereignty about it's time for Moses to die. And he, in love for his people, he asked God to give him a new leader to shepherd them and to be responsible for them. The Lord responded to Moses, telling Moses to, in Numbers chapter 27, verses 18 and 19, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him in their presence." So what God did is he told Moses, "I've already chosen who's going to be the shepherd to lead the people, and it's going to be Joshua. And I want you to use the high priest and ordain and commission him as your replacement." Following the Lord's command, Moses transferred the leadership of the Israelites as God's people, as God's sheep, to Joshua. Although the leadership characteristics of Joshua differed from the leadership characteristics of Moses, God had maintained continuity to fulfill his promises to the Israelites by appointing Joshua as a man of faith and experience to lead Israel. Again, we have a generation passing. God's promise leading to his eternal objective hasn't been fulfilled, and God continuing to the next generation his promises. So what we have next in chapters 28 and 29 is God saying, we're changing leadership, we're changing generations, but we're not changing your relationship with me. You still need to make the sacrifices and perform the worship services that I directed your parents to perform. So although the final 11 chapters in the book of Numbers recounted the changes which had taken place with respect to the new generation and the transfer of leadership of the Israelite community, the requirement for Israelites to make sacrifices to and worship God did not change. In chapters 28 and 29 of the book of Numbers, God repeated his requirements for the Israelites to make sacrifices in atonement for their sin when they finally settled in the promised land by reminding them of the sacrifices to be offered by the priests daily, weekly on the Sabbath day, monthly on the first day of each month when there was a new moon, and throughout the year when they celebrated the feast which God enumerated to the first generation who departed from Egypt. We're going quickly through these because we already studied before, but daily the Lord required the priest to present 2 lambs, a year old without defect, as a regular burnt offering. 1 lamb was sacrificed in the morning and 1 in the evening at twilight. Remember, the blood of the lamb was taken into the holy place and the blood was sprinkled on the altar of incense. This sacrifice of the 2 lambs, 1 in the morning, 1 in the twilight, was accompanied with a grain offering of fine flour mixed with oil from pressed olives and a drink offering. Now, every Sabbath day, an additional offering of 2 lambs, a year old without defect, along with a drink and grain offering, were to be presented by the priest. So you had the daily offering, but on the Sabbath, you were added to it the sacrifice an additional offering of 2 lambs. Now, on the first of every month, which started with the new moon, the priests were required to present to the Lord a burnt offering consisting of 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs. Let's see, I think a year old, okay, at least a year old, not 80-year-old, without defect, along with the specified grain and drink offerings. In addition, the priests were required to sacrifice 1 male goat as a sin offering. Okay, then we get to the feast. On the 14th day of the first month, that should all bring to your attention right away, the Israelites were to celebrate the Passover, which was to be followed on the next day by a 7-day feast of unleavened bread. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the priests were required to present as a burnt offering 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs a year old without defect, along with the specified grain and drink offerings. The same sacrifices were required on each of the days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the first Sabbath after the Passover, the priests were required to celebrate the Feast of the First Fruits by making an offering of new grain to the Lord. 50 days after the celebration of the first fruits, the priests were required to sacrifice as a burnt offering 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old as an aroma pleasing to the Lord, along with the specified grain and oil offerings in celebration of the Feast of Weeks, which took place on Pentecost. Pentecost is another, it translates 50 days after the celebration of the Feast of the First Fruits. Now, we go to the fall feast. On the first day of the 7th month, the priests celebrated the Feast of Trumpets by preparing a burnt offering of 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old, all without defect, along with the specified grain and oil offerings. They were also required to include 1 male goat as a sin offering in atonement. On the 10th day of this, if you remember, the Feast of the Trumpets is when they were to contemplate their sin and to look at the coming year when their sin would be atoned for. It concluded with the 10th day of the 7th month, when the priest would celebrate, perform the sacrifices on the Day of Atonement, which was that day each year when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies and made the sacrifices. On that day, they had a burnt offering of 1 lamb, 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old without defect, along with the specified grain and oil offerings, and to sacrifice 1 male goat as a sin offering. So these are words that are taken out of these chapters in the book of Numbers. It is not a complete description of these fests, but it's basically a description of the animals to be sacrificed. Then on the 15th day of the 7th month, when the Israelites celebrated the week-long Feast of Tabernacles, on the first day of the feast, the priests were required to present a burnt offering of 13 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs a year old, all without defect, along with the specified grain offerings. Each day thereafter, for the next 6 days, the number of bulls sacrificed was reduced by 1. So it went from 13 on the first day, 12 on the second day, 11 on the third day, all the way down to the 6th day. And then on the 8th day, only 1 bull was sacrificed. So doing my mathematics, if they're correct, during the year, the required animal sacrifices totaled 113 bulls, 32 rams, and 1,086 lambs, in addition to more than a ton of flour and 1,000 bottles of oil and wine, which were offered all to the Lord as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Now, this did not include all the free will and other individual offerings or the vow offerings or sacrifices made by members of the Israelite community throughout the year. So then we go in this chapter to God's reminder about making vows. Chapter 30. In chapter 30, God reminded the Israelites to take seriously any vows or pledges made by them to God, and not to break their word, but must do everything that they vowed to do. This chapter adds something to the vows that we didn't learn before, and that is it makes a distinction for young women who are married, or still who are unmarried and not living with their father's household, by allowing the husband or the father to I'm sorry, it makes a distinction for young married women and those who are still living in their father's household by allowing the husband, if the woman is married, or the father, if they're living in the father's household, to nullify or forbid the vow. So a woman is protected by the husband who can nullify any vow made by a married woman or by a woman living in her father's household. If the father or the husband hears the woman making the vow but remains silent, then the woman is bound by the vow. Now we're going to go into chapter 31. God instructed Israel to take vengeance against the Midianites. And this is the Midianite war. Because the Midianites had joined with Moab against Israel and had sent women to seduce the Israelites into apostasy, God instructed Moses to take vengeance against them. In Numbers chapters 31, verses 1 and 2, the Lord said to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that, you will be gathered to your people." In obedience, Moses mobilized 1,000 men from each of the tribes of Israel and sent them into battle against the Midianites. In chapters 31, verses 3 through 6, the scriptures say, "So Moses said to the people, arm some of your men to go to war against the Midianites and carry out the Lord's vengeance on them. Send into battle 1,000 men from each of the tribes of Israel." So 12,000 men armed for battle, 1,000 from each tribe were supplied from the clans of Israel. Moses sent them into battle, 1,000 from each tribe, along with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, who took with him articles from the sanctuary and trumpets for signaling. Now the presence of Phinehas and the sacred vessels taken from the sanctuary and the presence of the trumpets demonstrated that this was a holy war against the Midianites. Because of their opposition to Israel and their pagan seduction of the Israelites, God declared judgment against the Midianites and called upon Israel to punish them. The army of Israel killed every man, including the 5 kings of Midian, took captive the Midianite woman and children, and took as plunder all the Midianite herds, flocks, and goods, burned all their towns, and returned with their captives and plunders to the plain of Moab. They also killed Balaam, who had joined the Midianites, and he was killed with the sword of the Israelites' army. When Moses saw that the army had returned, but they had not killed all the women and the male children, he was angry, and he ordered them to kill all of the captives except every girl who had never slept with a man. In Numbers chapter 31, verses 14 through 18, the scriptures say, Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, who returned from the battle. "Have you allowed all the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice, and they were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who never slept with a man. God was purging, punishing, and judging the Midianites for seducing the Israelite people and opposing God's plan being carried out through the nation of Israel. Because this was a holy war, God directed that everything which could withstand fire be purified by fire, and everything else purified by water, and that everyone in the army who had killed or touched anyone who had been killed be ceremonially clean by remaining outside the camp for 7 days, and by purifying themselves, their garments, and their plunder with the water of cleansing, using the ashes of the red heifer, on the 3rd and 7th day before returning to the camp at the end of the 7th day. So even though they were carrying out a holy war, they were needed purification because of their defilement of coming in contact with dead bodies and the impurity of the Moabite possessions. And so they were required to go through the ritual of cleansing. Now, the plunder that they kept after killing the women who had been with a man and all the male boys and all the other occupants of Midian was divided, half of the plunder going to the soldiers who took part in the battle and the other half going to the rest of the Israelite community. Both the soldiers who took part in the battle and the rest of the community were then required to give a portion of their plunder to the Levites. I like to do aggregate figures because it tells you the scale of this war. The total plunder taken included 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 women who had never slept with a man, with half of the plunder going to the fighting men and the other half going to the community of Israelites. That's a massive plunder that they received from conquering the Midianites. The next thing we come to in chapter 32 is a really bizarre request being made by the Reubenites and Gadites, who requested Moses, we look at the grazing fields in the Transjordan on the east side of the Jordan River, and we'd like to stay here. We don't want to go into the promised land and take it. What do you think? Moses's hairs probably stood up in the back of his neck. He was afraid that their request would discourage the other Israelites from entering into and conquering the land in Canaan, which God promised to give them, and would lead to a rebellion against entering the land, similar to what the previous generation did. This might spread to the other tribes. Moses was also concerned that their request would be considered by God as a refusal to follow God's command for the Israelites to take possession of the land that God had promised to Abraham. So Moses apparently showed his anger at the Reubenites and Gadites for requesting this. So the Reubenites and Gadites modified their proposal. They changed their request by agreeing to build pens for their livestock and dwellings for their families. But after doing that, they agreed to arm their fighting men and send them with the rest of the army of Israel to fight for the Lord to conquer the land west of the Jordan, and that they would return to their families only after God's enemies had been driven from the land and all of Canaan defeated. So what they did is they said, oh, no. What we really meant is, they didn't say this the first time, but what they really meant is, yeah, we'll send our fighting men with the rest of the tribe of Israel, and we'll help them conquer the land that God promised to Israel. And only then, after it's conquered, will we return to our families on the east side of the Jordan, in the Transjordan area. Accepting the modified proposal made by the Reubenites and Gadites, Moses gave half of the tribe of Manasseh the land, cities, and territory east of the Jordan River, which the Israelites had taken from the kingdoms of Sihon and Og. And so he added half of the tribe of Manasseh. So when we get down to our study of the conquest of the promised land and we look at where the various tribes end up, this explains why 2.5 tribes of the Israelites remained on the east side in the Transjordan instead of taking possession of the promised land. In chapters 33, we have Israel's 40-year journey through the wilderness. What this is a chronicle of the stages or places where the Israelites camped during their journey, which they had taken from the land of Egypt until they arrived and camped at the plains of Moab. The chapter concludes with God's command for Israel to completely drive out all of the inhabitants and destroy all their pagan images, idols, and high places. In Numbers chapters 33, verses 50 through 54, the scriptures say, on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, demolish all their high places, take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. Distribute the land by lot according to your clans. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance. To a smaller group, a smaller one. Whatever falls to them by lot will be theirs. Distribute it according to your ancestral tribes. I think after defeating the Midianites, it was clear what the objective of the Israelites was in terms of fulfilling God's command to conquer and take possession of the land of Canaan. They were to completely remove the inhabitants, destroy their idols, their high places and their places of worship, and to take full possession of the entire land. The Lord gave a warning that if the Israelites fail to do what the Lord commanded, then the Lord will do to the Israelites what he planned to do to the inhabitants who occupied the land that the Lord was going to give to the Israelites. In Numbers chapters 33, verses 55 and 56, the scriptures say, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, Those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you live. And then I will do to you what I plan to do to them. How prophetic. Because if you study the books of Samuel and the Kings and Chronicles, because Israel left inhabitants in the land, they became sores in their eyes and thorns in their sides, and Israel fell into worshiping Baal and worshiping in Asherah poles and in high places, and eventually through the nations of Assyria and Babylon, they were removed from the promised land. In chapters 34 through 36, we conclude the book of Numbers with God designating the boundaries and reminding the Israelites how to allocate the promised land among them. In chapter 34 of the book of Numbers, God gave the Israelites the boundaries of the land which they were to conquer and appointed men to oversee the distribution and allocation of the land. The Israelites were to conquer and take possession of the land from the desert of Sin in the south, the Transjordan on the east. This is the area to be occupied by the Gadites and the Reubenites and half of the tribe of Manasseh, the Mediterranean coast in the west, and the north, or Mount Or in the north. This isn't the Mount Or that Aaron went to and died. In chapter 35, the Lord directed that the Israelites designate 48 cities or towns to be occupied by the Levites as priestly cities. These priestly towns included 3,000 feet of pasture line on each side of the town, measured from the center of the town. So you had the city center 3,000 feet out, and around these priestly cities were the pasture lands that were given to them so that they could take care of the livestock and other things that were given to them by the other tribes to support them. 6 of the towns allocated to the Levites, 6 of the 48, were designated to be as cities of refuge, 3 in the Transjordan area and 3 in the land of Canaan. And what these cities of refuge were for if anybody accidentally killed another Israelite, they could flee to the city of refuge where they would stay and escape being killed in a revenge killing by the family members who survived the person they accidentally killed. They had to stay in the city of refuge, awaiting trial, or when the high priest died, then they could leave the city of refuge and they were safe from any revenge by the family members. The chapter also defined what constitutes murder and sanctions, and allows the avenger of blood to put the murderer to death when he meets him. The cities of refuge were for accidental deaths. If you intended to kill somebody, then you didn't have the escape to the city of refuge, and then you had to, the family members could avenge the death of their loved one by avenging and by taking the blood. It's interesting that we have definitions of murder that somewhat flow from this definition that's in the book of Numbers. Essentially, if you intend to kill somebody, and that intent is inferred if you use an object like something made of metal or a rock or something that you know that if you use it to club or hit somebody, they're going to die, that infers intent. But intentional murder crimes were punishable by death, avenged by the family members. If there was a question, then the accused would go to the city of refuge, awaiting trial. If it was determined that it was an intentional murder, he was kicked out of the city of refuge, and the family members could avenge the death of their loved one. Now we get to the final part of the book of Numbers, chapter 36. And we go back to the daughters of Zephaniah. What if the daughter inherited the land from their father, and then they decided to marry an Israelite from another tribe? Well, the question is that then in the year of Jubilee, the land that they got from their father, from the tribe of Manasseh, would then go to the tribe of the husband that was not the tribe of Manasseh, another tribe. And so what they basically were doing, they're saying slowly through clan members dying without sons surviving them, and the daughters marrying outside their tribe, the clan would lose their inheritance to other tribes. And so one tribe would gain over the other tribes. So Moses went to God, and God instructed Moses basically that these daughters who received their father's inheritance because the father died without a surviving son are required to marry within their clan or tribe so that their inheritance would not be lost to another tribe. And so there's some protection of God intended them to have 12 tribes, to have inheritance allotted to them forever, and for the whatever they lost, the inheritance to be redeemed on the year of Jubilee. And he did not want this to be weakened or lost by marriage outside the tribe. Kind of speaks towards God's plan of eternal inheritance that we will inherit when we receive our inheritance in heaven. So I went fast, but we covered the last 11 chapters of the book of Numbers. And what I tried to draw out are the important points that come from these chapters. Hopefully, if you ever decide to go through these 11 chapters, that these highlights will remind you of what's being covered in these chapters. But I'm going to use 3 discussion questions to draw out the teaching points, the messages that we can draw from these 11 chapters. And it's the reason why I put all these chapters together and applications.
Yeah.
God promises are eternal and flow from one generation of God's people to the next until God's eternal plan is completed. Each generation or each individual is required to establish their own relationship with God through their knowledge and obedience to God's word and by exercising their faith in God's promises. As God's people, we can never lose sight of or take our eyes off the goal or the objective of God's redemptive plan, which calls for God's people to live eternally in a holy relationship with God. In his sovereignty, God numbers those who he calls, and in his providence, God allocates among his people the promises of redemption which God made from the very beginning.
Very good. Amen.
Amen.